Professor T. Grandon Gill. The facilitator, Dr. Gill has extensive experience in case method research, as well as in writing cases for classroom use and facilitating case discussions. His MBA and DBA are both from Harvard Business School, where the case method originated. He's author of the book Informing with the Case Method, that's 2011 Informing Science Press, and recently became a founding editor of the Journal of Information Technology Education, Discussion Cases, a publication outlet for case studies in the MIS, IT, and informing and science fields. Interested participants will be encouraged to remain in touch with the facilitator for possible participation in future grant initiatives and workshops.
Thank you.
Dr. Gill, here we are. We can tell any voice, so you can do something.
All right, well, anyway, my name is Grandon Gill, and this is the case workshop, or case method and integration of academic activities, the long title. And what I'm going to be doing today is talking a little bit about case writing, principally discussion cases, but I'll also talk about research cases. We'll talk about the domains, the process, and so forth. All the materials that you have, including the handouts, are up on my website for free download, as is a copy of the book Informing with the Case Method. So you can just download the electronic version. At the end of the session at 3:30, for those people who have signed up, or the first 30 people who've signed up, we also have hard copies of the book that will be distributed at the end of the session. So, let me just proceed here. So, the overview of what I'm going to do, I'm going to talk first about what the case method is. In the bio, it says the case method originated at Harvard Business School, and that's sort of true. It actually, variations of the case method have appeared in medical schools and in law schools, and the law school version predated the business school version. But Harvard was the first institution to use the case method in the classroom and remains one of the principal proponents of case method research. I'll begin by talking about the pedagogy, different types of cases, and how they're used. The handout, for those of you who have not gotten handouts, maybe we can arrange to have someone distribute these. I've got handouts at all the seats, but for people who are sitting backwards, we have an extra. Maybe I'll just put these over here so that, and if somebody comes in, you can just give them one. The handout begins with an exercise where I give you 3 different cases, and we try to figure out what each one would be useful for. Naturally, the use is somewhat limited by the fact that all 3 cases are about the 3 little pigs, but we'll ignore that. We'll call that theory. I'll talk a little bit about facilitating case discussions in the classroom and trying to measure the outcomes of case method learning. Then I'll move into writing case studies, which applies broadly to both research and discussion cases. And I'll talk about some of the steps associated with preparing a case study, particularly of an organization. And also a little bit about publishing case studies. My principal focus will be discussion cases, but at any time during the presentation, if you want to ask a question or interrupt me and talk about research cases, I'm delighted to do so. Finally, I'll talk about some of the broader impacts, which goes back to the title of the presentation, and talk a little bit about how cases can impact an institution and its relationship with the local community. And this is one of the things that I am very excited about working with case studies. I'll also talk about a funding opportunity that I'm planning to pursue and looking for some partners on. And I'll also talk perhaps briefly about a call for papers that has just gone out involving case studies. So At any time during this process, if you've got a question, just raise your hand. We even have a mic here which is going to be sensitive enough to pick up your question if you say it loudly, because, of course, this session is being recorded. So, first topic, what is the case method? I have the good fortune or the misfortune to be the class statistician for my MBA class. I graduated in 1982. That means this year I'm going back to my 30th reunion, where once again that I will discover that my net worth is less than 1/10 of the average net worth of my classmates, and my income is less than 1/3 of the average income of my classmates. Now, as payment for this, well, they put me up there because they know that if they have me present, none of my classmates are going to feel jealous. Among the graduates of my class are both Jamie Dimon, the CEO of J.P. Morgan Chase, and Jeff Immel, the CEO of General Electric. But I get to present because nobody's jealous about me. But one of the things I get to do is I get to toss things into the questionnaire from time to time that I do not call research because I haven't done an IRB on them, but which nonetheless is interesting. So we asked the Harvard class of 82, this was for our 25th reunion, what they thought the greatest strength of the MBA program at Harvard was. And they were given a whole list of choices. Here are the top 5. 34% of them said the case method. 11% and 32% talked about networking with other people. 32% and 14% talked about networking. The faculty only got 11%. That's a sad commentary. And then there were a whole variety of other things. But the thing that's important is the thing that they liked most about their experience doing the Harvard MBA was the case method. And that's a good thing because our entire MBA consisted of discussing 900 cases and very little else. We might have had 20 lecture sessions during the entire 2-year program. So the focus of this presentation is going to be on discussion cases. So what is a discussion case? A discussion case is a case that is specifically designed to promote classroom discussion. Very often discussion cases and research cases are created together because they have a lot of the same elements. But the key thing that a discussion case does is it exposes participants to realistic situations. Every case I deal with is an authentic case. It means that someone, in many cases myself, has gone out to the company, interviewed people, looked at their documents, been given lots of access to information. So we make it as realistic as possible. It encourages higher order learning. I'll explain a little bit more about this later, but basically the idea here is that there are very few cases that have simple solutions, and there are almost no cases that have single solutions. Essentially, almost any case you deal with is going to have multiple combinations of possibilities. So it really forces students to think about situations. It also provides a structured forum for sharing participant experiences. I became very aware of this at the last IREPS, or the last multi-conference, when one of the presenters, one of the keynote presenters, talked about the use of case studies in Latin America to get guerrillas, the government, unions, and academics all talking together in the same forum. Now, how did they do that? Well, they put together a case on Indonesia, brought that case in, the parties came in to discuss it, and what they discovered is a lot of what was going on in Indonesia was also going on in Central America, and it provided an excellent forum for sharing participant experiences. And this is one of the great reasons that I used the same case in my last semester. I used the same case in my undergraduate class and in my executive MBA class. Why? The discussions went totally differently, because in the executive MBA class, they had a lot of experiences that they wanted to share. So a lot of times the discussion went off as they talked about their experiences with similar situations. In the undergraduate class, a lot more time was helping them, through discussion, get a handle on what the situation was. Now, it's very, very hard to find people who hate the case method. I've looked long and hard for that, because a lot of people ignore the case method. And in academia, being ignored is worse than being hated. Because if you're hated, they'll reference you, and you get to add to your citation count. If you're ignored, you're just not seen. So, I did, however, find an article by someone from the University of Florida, a fellow named Shugan, who teaches, who is the editor-in-chief of Marketing Science and is a very well-published marketer. And he gave 7 reasons why we should not be involved with cases. And what I thought was interesting about this reasons was that it showed that he had such a different opinion of what cases were than I did, that understanding his reasons helps us understand why some people might like cases and some people wouldn't. His first reason is that the Socratic method is extraordinarily effective for teaching many skills, and these are direct quotes, by the way, such as applying written law. However, it is ancient and inferior to the scientific method. I really apologize he's making fun of the Greeks here, but you can...
I'm used to it.
Yeah. Well, regardless of that particular, the particular prejudice involved there, the fact is the case method, as done in most discussion contexts, is not the Socratic method. Now, in law school, it often is the Socratic method. The Socratic method involves an instructor asking questions of an individual, so you basically have a dialogue going on. But in a good case discussion, the vast majority of the discussion is between the students themselves. You, as the facilitator of the discussion, orchestrate the discussion. You try and help it go in directions that will explore interesting aspects of the case, but you do not lecture the students. That's one of the big mistakes that novice case facilitators do. So this isn't really right. This isn't the way it's conducted. Second, the case method weakens the link between research and the classroom, removing critical incentives for relevant research. So what he's saying here is that cases are not research. The only time that's a useful assertion is when you're going before the IRB to write a case, because then they'll give you an exemption. But the fact is, in a case study, you as a faculty member are going out into the field, you are seeing what's happening, you are exploring what is happening, you are engaging in a dialogue with the executives involved, and this doesn't have to just be businesses. You can be nonprofits, you can be, I've done a number of cases on our university, but you as a faculty member are learning things. Apparently the goal of research is not to have the faculty member learn things which then get communicated. Apparently the point of research is to do statistical analysis of surveys. So, third, surrendering teaching to those with little knowledge of the vast marketing literature cuts the quality of marketing education. Let me tell you, as a case facilitator, it is vastly more important that you understand the context of a particular situation than it is if you are lecturing from a lesson plan. My university is developing a whole bunch of online courses. We're going to develop an online master's program. What's happening is that a lot of the people who are doing lecture courses are writing up the scripts, then they're giving it to someone else to narrate because they've got a better voice. So what we're saying is the lecture could be done by a pure narrator who doesn't know anything about the subject if you give them the right script. In a lecture course, you can work out of a textbook. During a case discussion, anything can happen. Fourth, the case method can teach false confidence. I think he was thinking about Harvard folks there, because we truly are taught arrogance in everything we do. But I don't think it's the case method that gave us that particular instruction. I think most of us were really arrogant when we came in. And some people, as a result of the case method, become more arrogant. But a lot of us become less arrogant because it turns out we almost never get the solution right. There's usually not a right or wrong, but very rarely do we come up with a solution that's even workable until we've discussed it. And so, for many of us, it builds humility. I became more arrogant, of course, but for many people, it builds humility. Fifth, we could lose our best students. Better students who have already acquired analytical thinking skills and confidence might seek more scientific content and technical training. Well, this basically equates analytical with competent. And that worked real well in Wall Street over the past 5 years, where basically the Wall Street nerds have done a good job in making the stock market and everything else go circulating all over the place with their algorithms. I have great respect for technical skills, and I am truly a geek. I write all my own software. I do a lot of geeky things. I recently did a 121 episode Buffy the Vampire Slayer marathon. Don't tell me I'm not a geek. However, I also have respect for other ways of thinking. 6, some great research might never reach the classroom because translating it into the case method format is too challenging. He actually gave some examples of great research, and I was just scratching my head. There was one piece of research that he described that could only be applicable to CEOs of major film companies. So there might be 15 people in the world that research would be applicable to, but it was methodologically great. What I'm arguing here is that if your results are so complicated that you cannot communicate them to practice, then what makes it great research? Nobody's ever going to use it. Finally, the case method rarely exposes students to the later tools for making decisions. This spring semester, I did a course. We had 12 case studies in it. We wrote 11 of them for the course. Not a single one of those case studies was more than 3 months old, and several of the case studies were written while the class was being conducted. In fact, it was rather exciting trying to get them ready before we discussed them. How long does it take to get a paper published in a top journal in your field? What's the publication cycle? Yeah, a lifetime in many cases, but 3 years if you're lucky. So tell me that this doesn't provide us access to the latest thinking. So, at any rate, by describing the disadvantages, I've also made it pretty clear what I think the advantages are, because it's not that he's wrong, it's just that he has a different perspective. Okay, so what I'd like to do now is spend about 10 minutes having you skim the 3 Little Pigs. Do not try to read them in all in detail. They are not great works of prose. But what I want you to do... They have some lovely puns. Oh, yes. Yeah. Well, I had to have fun, too. I explain that to my students all the time. The purpose of the course is to entertain the professor. Any learning that takes place is secondary. But at any rate... go over these things, because after you've gone over them, then I'm going to have you try to figure out which of the 3 Little Pigs things would be appropriate for a discussion case, for research, and so forth. So you can actually, if you want, you can pause the video for a moment. All right. So what I like to do now for each of the questions, and yeah, this is the advantage of if you've marked it, of remembering your marks, ask which of the cases is more suitable. Now, I understand these are fictional cases, and I understand that I was having way too much fun when I was writing them. But just, play along with me for this one. The first question is, which of the cases do you feel would be best used for illustrating cause and effect and to provide a deeper understanding of a situation and its ramifications. How many of you thought that was case A? Don't be shy. We got one. All right. Two. How many of you thought that was case B? Okay. We have, we have some very shy people here. Don't worry. You can be arguing me out of anything. How many of you thought it was case C? We don't have any case C's. So it was sort of a half-hearted tie between A and B. What would you look for in trying to decide if a case was good for understanding cause and effect?
Description of both the cause and the effect.
Okay. And did any of the cases describe both the cause and the effect? Which one? The A case.
A completely, B to some extent.
B set up a decision, but we don't know what the decision is going to be. You're right. It led up to the situation, but B faced us with a decision, whereas A was basically looking back at the situation and analyzing what happened and the decisions that were made.
I'm not so sure that a stochastic effect is not an effect.
Well,
Because it isn't a matter at that point of saying we don't know. It's a matter of saying we have more or less understandable probabilities. And I think you can argue that. I think that that's a fuller understanding of that.
however, I can tell you if I were trying to write an article describing cause and effect, I'd really want to talk about the effect. Okay, so let's move on to the next one. Now, which one do you think would best serve as a basis of class discussion? How many of you think it's the A case? How many think it would be the B case? Okay, we've got a fair number of B's. How many of you think it would be the C case? We've got a couple there. This is the... So, why does someone think it might be the B case? Someone who raised their hand, just tell me. Give me an idea. Why do you think it might be the B case? I'm not trying to put you on the spot. Would it help if I told you I think you're right? Just explain why. Someone, please.
Well, there's a question that's caused, so there's something to discuss.
There's a decision to be made. Exactly right. Now, sometimes some people call it a problem to be solved. My experience is when you go into organizations, don't tell them that you're trying to solve a problem, because that predisposes them to think that they have a problem and that upsets them. Everybody recognizes that they have decisions. They don't recognize they have. So essentially, you think there are reasonable arguments for different versions of the decision or for different choices? Okay. So that provides something that you can discuss. Now, the C case, the question I would ask about the C case is, do you think that the C case might have a correct answer? The way it is framed. Do you think you could find a combination of the different attributes used to build a house that would optimize some value? If not, it's because I wrote it improperly, because that was the way the case was designed to be written. I would be loath to try to discuss the C case for two reasons. One, it's extremely complicated, or would be if I gave it everything I got. And when you have a complicated problem, it's very hard to keep the discussion such that everybody, is paying attention. The other problem with it is that if there's a right answer to it, if you believe that there's a right answer, don't you want to show people how to get the right answer, as opposed to showing them the many ways in which you can get the wrong answer? One of the things that I used to hate when I was doing my MBA, in the first year, we took an accounting course they called Control. The professor was new to the case method, and we were learning accounting through case studies. And he would frequently ask students to, do the bookkeeping up on the board, and they'd inevitably get it wrong. But he didn't want to tell them that. And I'm looking out there, and everybody in the class, sometimes including myself, is writing down the wrong solution. Then we have to go back and usually correct it at the end of the class when there's no time to discuss it. Generally speaking, if I feel there's a right way to do things, I'd rather tell people how to do it. Now, that doesn't mean the case is not good for something. I think the case is very good for certain things. However, I would not want to discuss it because I don't like discussing things when I'm completely convinced that my answer is the only right answer. To illustrate specific situation or the effects of a course of action, well, that's basically the same question as the A case rephrased as the first one, because once again, it shows a course of action. Now, how about the next one? To be used the basis of a walkthrough of a decision-making process, independently or in the classroom. How many of you think that would be the A case? B case? C case? Oh, good. We've got some C cases here. Yeah, I would say the C case would be a good example of the use of a case study for a walkthrough. You want to explain, because this is a very complicated situation, and you can't just give people a complicated problem and expect them to solve it immediately. But the problem gives them context. It's the same reason why you need to do word problems as well as just equations in a math course, because students have a lot of trouble taking the equations and putting them into context. But you need to walk them through a few of these, and then eventually you might give a case like this as an exercise. Very valuable potential case. I have a number of cases like this I use for database class, where students have to design a database. And there's pretty much one right way to design some of the simple databases. You know, small variations, but the basic theme is the same. And that first I walk them through one, and then I have them try to design one on their own. So that answers the question to be used as an exercise for students as well. Now, I am not claiming that everything that I have said is perfectly correct. The world of cases is messy. But the point is that when you are using a case or when you are writing a case, the first thing that you have to think about is, what am I planning to use this case for, and how is it structured? Is it going to achieve the results that I'm looking for? And if the results you're looking for are a class discussion, you want to build it around a decision. Now, why bother with cases at all? Well, this is actually from a paper that I'm just about to submit to the Academy Management Review, and it basically deals with the three different ways we think about complexity. If I were to ask people what the complexity of a task was in this classroom, I virtually guarantee everyone would give me a different definition, and many of them would be contradictory. However, what I found is that there are three general dimensions about which people think about complexity. The first is the unfamiliarity dimension. What do we need to know in order to perform a task? When a task is unfamiliar, it feels difficult, and we associate difficulty with complexity. As we practice a task more and more, it seems less difficult. That hasn't changed the task, but it's changed our perception of it. A master pianist can play a piano piece while holding a discussion on almost any topic because everything is automatic. You ask someone who's starting the piano to do that, and you won't get two notes before they start coming out wrong. So this is the unfamiliarity dimension. Now, the second dimension is the question of what is our goal. And this is, when I talk about objective complexity, this is what I talk about. And this is basically, what is the end point we want to achieve for this task? If a task has a right answer, there's one end point you want to reach. If a task has multiple good answers that can be very different from each other, we call that landscape rugged, because what it means is that the individual components of a decision cannot be looked at independently. They can only be looked at in combination. The example I like to use for this is a recipe. Social scientists would love to take all the data from a cookbook and ask questions like, is garlic a good or a bad ingredient? Well, that's not a meaningful question. Garlic is good for some recipes. Garlic, I don't want garlic in my angel food cake. I'm funny that way. There is a restaurant in San Francisco that includes garlic in everything. It's called the Stinky Rose.
It does have one vampire dish.
It actually does, yeah, I didn't. Yeah, good point. Returning back to Buffy the Vampire Slayer, as I mentioned earlier. Then the final question is, how do we get there? And that is complicated. The amount of knowledge required to perform the task falls in this. We think of tasks that require a lot of knowledge as being more complex than tasks that don't. The point is, these are three fundamentally different dimensions, though in fact we can't exchange things. For example, if we say, this is the goal of your task, we've added a constraint. The constraint may make it more complicated to complete the task, but it eliminates the ambiguity associated with goals. If we go out and learn something, we're basically taking unfamiliarity and translating it into knowledge, so we make the task, our understanding of the task, more complicated, but it seems less unfamiliar. So they all involve sort of the same underlying concept, but they're very, very different aspects of it. So, just to review decomposability, which is probably the least familiar of these things, in a decomposable world, if you have a bunch of attributes affecting the fitness of an outcome, they're additive. So, no matter what I do to X4, it's only going to make this much impact on fitness. Now, what that means is that when you want to solve a problem like this, you try to find the best value for each of your x's, and you can do that independently. That makes the task much, much simpler. In a rugged task, all the variables interact, and what that means is that when you change the value of x1, it can have a huge effect. The example I use is what happens when you leave the teaspoon of baking powder out of a cake recipe. Totally changes the nature of the cake. But how many of you, when you taste a cake, say, well, 90% of the taste of this cake is from the baking powder? Well, that would suggest a really bad recipe if what you're mainly tasting is baking powder. Yet it acts fundamentally. I often like to joke, the silliest exercise, well, one of the silliest exercises I've ever had to do in my academic career happened the last couple of times I went up for promotion. The second time was successful, so I don't have to do that again. But I had to estimate my percentage of contribution to every article where I had co-authors. And, my immediate reaction to that was, that's the answer, that's the Jeopardy question, that's the answer to the Jeopardy question, what number, a group of numbers that will always add up to more than 100. What are the co-authors' estimates of their contribution to a paper? But, nevertheless, papers don't work that way. We understand that. I mean, it's a, it's a collaborative effort, and you can't really describe what percentage of fitness owes to each of the authors. So, all right, I think I've talked about this. The key things about rugged landscapes is the greater the complexity, the larger the number of peaks. And we also don't really know how good peaks are. One of the main things that we try to do as humans is trying to figure out the fitness of things. I mean, think about how we judge the fitness of articles. We've got all sorts of metrics. Okay, what journal is it published in? How many citations does it have? Do any of these things really describe the quality of the article? They're estimates. What's the estimates that students use when they try to decide what college to go to? U.S. News and World Report rankings is the place a lot of them go. Are those rankings meaningful? Consider like the top-ranked school. A couple of years ago, it was Harvard. Just how useful is that ranking to the 99.99% of the population who could not possibly get into Harvard? Why is that ranking valuable?
Because it's you.
Because we use it to estimate the fitness of the university. It's the best estimate that we come up with. It's not a very good estimate, but it's the estimate that people use. And if lots of people are using the same estimate, then everybody thinks it must be true. So I'm going to bring this back to cases now. If you take a look at teaching cases is a broader category than discussion cases. There are a lot of different types of teaching cases that one might create. The discussion case almost always focuses on a decision that needs to be made. In a long discussion case, you get the full context of the decision as much as possible, in the amount of time your students are willing to put in. Our typical discussion cases in the Journal of IT Education, discussion cases are about 25 single-space pages long. You can't do more than one a week of these, and they provide quite a bit of context. Do they capture the full complexity of the decision? No, but they capture about as much complexity as you can handle in a class period. Short cases provide a decision without much context at all. Sometimes, some of the interpersonal cases don't provide a lot of context because we have enough tacit knowledge, so we don't need all that stuff put in the case. Now, an example case is like a research case in that it tells a story about cause and effect. Now, research cases always have theory embedded in it, but example cases may not have theory. They may just tell you what happens. And example cases can be very useful. A lot of faculty members I speak to feel that whenever they describe a case of a business during a lecture, they're using the case method. But that's not what is typically referred to as the case method. The case method is discussing the case. That does not mean there's anything wrong with examples. One of the most resonant forms of communication is the story. I'd much rather use an example to illustrate a point than describe a theory on the board, because I think there's a much greater chance it will be retained. However, it's different from a discussion case. A walkthrough case, this is like the C case that of the Three Little Pigs, gives you a rich problem-solving context. It can be used to guide students through a process, and then you can follow that up with an exercise case, which is basically a really expanded word problem. If you go into the sciences, there's a whole website hosted by New York State University, Buffalo, of cases for the sciences. Virtually all of them are what I would call walkthrough or exercise cases. They're not discussion cases, but they describe, but they believe these cases are very useful for their educational benefits in helping students understand scientific and engineering problems. Yes?
You mentioned earlier you do cases for your database course. How would you categorize that type of case?
I would categorize those as walkthrough and exercise cases, because for the most part, they're not really discussion cases. They're very rich word problems. But they're not examples, because I'm not telling them how to build a database. And as I say, I'm not really looking for a discussion. If you've got an invoice and it's got items, there's a certain relationship you expect between invoice and items, and if they get it backwards, as they usually do, that's not a different way of doing things. That's just wrong. Sometimes it's just wrong. So where do I see the different types of cases falling in? Well, if you have something that's not terribly unfamiliar, not terribly rugged, and not terribly complicated, lecture about it. No reason not to. Most efficient way to send that information out. As it gets more complicated, you want to supplement things like lectures with exercise cases, because that gives people the opportunity to practice with the complicatedness of it. Practice is the antidote to complicatedness. So that's reasonable. Now, as we move up in unfamiliarity, if it's not terribly complicated, an example case is good. Because an example provides a nice illustration, and typically your examples are not designed to present anything terribly deep. They're designed to present a type of relationship. As it gets more complicated, suddenly you've got a walkthrough. Your example will be too complicated for people to understand. The story will not resonate. The area that I'm most interested in is once you start to see ruggedness out here. And when you've got ruggedness, unfamiliarity, and complication, I think discussion cases are an extremely powerful tool for educating people. So, what are we trying to achieve when we start using things like discussion cases? Well, I'm sure many of you are familiar with Bloom's taxonomy of learning, and some of you are probably familiar with Newell and Simon's problem-solving taxonomy, intelligence, design, choice. Well, ultimately, if you look at most of the lecture courses that we have, and this has been a problem that is well established, we tend to focus a lot on knowledge. Occasionally we get to complication, but we often don't get a lot deep into an application, analysis, synthesis, and evaluation, which is really judgment. Because those are not easy things to convey through lecture. If you take a look at a case method, however, basically, if you look at my typical discussion case, a lot of information has to be digested to make a sensible choice, because the precept of the discussion case model is that you don't try to come up with a solution until you understand the context. There are no generic solutions to every problem. You always have to understand the context. Frequently there is choice, where you're given a series of alternatives, each of which has pros and cons, and you have to make the decision. And in some of the more advanced cases, you have to come up with your own design. For example, come up with an action plan. Come up with a product configuration or something like that. The point is that the case method framework gives you a lot of opportunity to design learning so that it covers pretty much the whole spectrum of cognitive skills, as opposed to focusing on some very specific sets. Now, you pay a price for that. One of the things that frequently frustrates people designing case courses is they have to cut back on their content. In a lecture course, you can go through as much content as you want, especially if you don't care if the students understand it. And I think one of the problems with today's college is, as we've developed more and more technologies, as we've globalized and so forth, there is much more content that people think that they have to cover. Now, the problem with that is that most of the time, covering the content and having students understand and internalize the content are two very different things, and we don't worry so much about the latter, because that's their problem, not ours as faculty members. But if you're going to start using cases, you have to accept the fact that you're not going to cover everything, because what you're focusing on is helping them build skills that will allow them to adapt to different situations, as opposed to acquiring facts and knowledge about every possible situation. So let me talk a little bit about the case method in the classroom. If you take a look at a typical class that I teach, students usually spend about 2 hours preparing each case before coming to class. At Harvard, the motivator was that when you got called on to open and you hadn't prepared the class, it was the most humiliating experience of your life. I know. I once couldn't remember the name of the case. I'd been rehearsing the business school show. I'd skimmed it and totally forgotten it. All I could remember about that one case was that it's very expensive to ship concrete. And even with my formidable communication skills, I could not turn that one fact into a good opening. In my class, what I do, because I'm dealing with undergraduates and different levels of graduates, is I typically give them 20 or 20 minutes, and when they walk into the classroom, I say, okay, here's the question, the pre-case question. And this is an in-depth question, one that you can study for it only by understanding the case. It's not, I'll look it up in the facts. And then I grade these each week. And it becomes pretty obvious who's coming in prepared and who's not. It doesn't actually take very long to grade these things. I prefer this to having them do a 5-page write-up on the case, which other instructors do, because then they're going to focus all their time about the write-up and none of their time thinking about the case. And also, those are excruciatingly painful to grade. This, at least, they're limiting the time they've got to do it. I usually have about 10 minutes involved in cold call opening. Nobody knows who's going to be asked to begin the case discussion. I choose them more or less at random, and then towards the end of the semester, people who haven't been speaking up are more likely to be called because I'm trying to get a sense of their participation. For the next 60 minutes or so, I facilitate the discussion. Facilitating a discussion means trying to keep the discussion going. It doesn't mean lecturing.
Stomping on anybody who talks too much.
And from time to time, stopping people who talk too much. However, that is usually not a problem with undergraduate MIS majors. I have to say that sometimes it's a relief to have someone you can call upon and know is going to give you a break for 5 minutes. But the thing that I want to avoid is lecturing. This is what's excruciatingly painful to me about this session is here I'm lecturing you about how you don't lecture in a case discussion. I think in March we're planning to do a very extended version of this workshop, and the way I get my students to understand case discussions is I give them a case study of an actual class that I attended that went absolutely amok, and then we discuss what I could have done. It was a case method class, so in the process of studying the case, they learn a lot about the case method. That case is included in the appendix, so one of the many appendices to my book. Finally, at the end of the class, I always ask them 2 questions. What are the 3 most important things you learned from the case, and how did the discussion change your views? And once again, I grade these. And this gives me a sense as to whether the discussion was actually effective or whether it served no useful purpose. And one of the things that I've been very pleased at is that 90% of the time the students are writing, wow, I never thought about this until we got into the discussion. But that's the way these cases tend to be. The key thing you have to remember is that most of the learning takes place in the discussion if you're going to facilitate a case method class, which means participation has to be heavily weighted. In my class, I never go with less than 50% of your grade determined by participation. Because if you say 5% of your grade is class participation, what you're saying is they're going to look at that decomposable thing of all the different points for your grade, and they're going to say, oh, well, that's only 5%, so I definitely don't want to spend my time doing that. There are other things like exams that are worth 30%, and therefore I should be spending my time trying to wheedle what questions are going to be on the exam out of the professor rather than trying to participate in the discussion. So, this is one of the things that and Harvard did 50% participation, but it really was more like 90% participation because what would happen is they'd read your exams after having seen you talking for a whole semester. And don't think that didn't change their opinions. So, you want your students not to try to seek the right answer. At the beginning of my class, and this is true undergraduate and graduate students, are always saying, well, what's the right answer to this case? A lot of these are cases that I've written. Last semester, I wrote 80% of the cases that we discussed. And they'll come to me, well, what's the right answer? Well, I don't know. Well, why don't I know? Well, because in most of these cases, I was writing about a decision that hadn't been made. I don't know what the outcome of that decision is going to be. If it wasn't a hard decision, I wouldn't be writing a case on it. So as a result, you have to learn not to seek the right answer, but you do want to try to avoid all the really lousy answers. And it's amazing how many lousy answers you can come up with. Combinations that simply wouldn't work. For example, a lot of times the students say, well, they ought to invest $1 million in this project. Well, that's fine, but the owner of this company runs a lawn care company. He isn't going to see $1 million, unless he saves for 30 years. So you want him to wait 30 years before he starts? I mean, these are the types of things that force people to think about the reality of decisions. The other nice thing about this, and this is really, it's sort of a given in U.S. universities. Oh, we love diversity. We're so proud of our diversity. But I will tell you, when you're teaching something like programming, diversity is a real pain in the neck. Because it means that 20% of your students could be doing 10 times the amount of work that you give, and 30% of your students can't master the amount of work that you've given. It's very hard because you have such a range. And as a consequence, what would be nice is if we could track groups by, their experience and abilities so that we were teaching a more cohesive group. Then you can lecture to them. But in the case method, diversity is king because you will get totally different perspectives from people that you did not expect. And the whole idea of the case method is to show people the breadth of solutions. And that really helps when you get some people who come from very different backgrounds, very different experiences. It's extremely valuable. This is, and that is something that, there's never been a teaching method I feel that benefits more from diversity than the case method. Okay, well, I think now is probably a good time to swap tapes since I'm about to start on another challenging topic, evaluating learning. Just give us